My name is Kent. I am lucky enough to be presenting with Mr. Scott Eckman and Russ Uhing from Lincoln Public Schools. And you're going to get a chance to see them, which is great. One of the things that's really nice about the presenters here is they had a school climate transformation grant in round 1 in 2014. And they've had 2 threats to sustainability, one of them being the loss of funding when the round ended. And then the other one is that Scott moved to a new position at the state level. So that loss of champion as we roll along. So thinking about that. But what I'm going to do with the time we've got is talk a little bit about some of the research on sustainability, and then hopefully share out some options and ideas for you and strategies to use. You know, there is a saying, and people say, at least they attribute it to a Chinese proverb, that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is right now. And I think about that a lot when I think of sustaining our projects, that we should be, the hope is that we're thinking about that right from the start. But if we're not, now is the time to start moving and pivoting to that. Because I want to share with you some realities that we have out here. So this is a figure that is very optimistically called the birth and death cycles of educational innovations. And so what you can see here, if you look on your screen, is each one of these solid lines is an initiative. Each one of the dotted vertical lines is a year. And that uppy downy axis here is implementation. And so what you can see is that sort of, at least according to this, the average initiative doesn't have much of a chance, because as soon as you start implementing one, the next one rolls along and takes it over, and it disappears and is gone. Has anybody experienced this in education? Maybe 1 or 2 of you out there. Here's the thing that I can see a few yeses and a daily. So if you're new to the field of education, you would probably think that maybe this is sort of a new pandemic related thing. But this picture is actually over 30 years old. This has described how we have been, our status quo in education work in this world of education that we're in. And so we're up against a whole lot when people are looking for that next new big thing that we see. And one of the things that I want to share with you that is a big challenge in this, hopefully this doesn't sound too scary for you, but it is called project mentality. And project mentality is this idea, if we think about the work that we're doing in the school climate transformation grant work that you're doing as a project, well, a project, right, has a start and a finish. And when people hear that term project, they are thinking, when is it beginning and when is it happening? And then when is it done? And so that is a really, really big challenge. And so this is like my first kind of call to arms right now, is that if you have labeled your work because you want it to be exciting and new, if you've labeled it a project or you're calling it the school climate transformation grant work, it is definitely time to rename it as something that you feel is going to be lasting and is not going to be a project or doesn't end when school climate transformation grant awards end. So what can we do to keep this work going? Well, one of the things we can do is we can lean on the frameworks that we have and the experience that we've had and your TA providers have had. So if you take a look, start thinking about how many schools have been using and sustaining PBIS over time, you can see a huge increase there have been a couple little drops. And as you can see, summer 2021, definitely a drop in terms of schools using that we think is certainly COVID-19 pandemic related, but still over 1 in 4 schools in the country supported by the center using this work. So some of the things that we can think about, well, okay, well, how has this work managed to outlast the birth and death cycles of educational innovations? Well, I'm only the 4th or 5th person to show you a slide like this or one that looks like this. Ruthie showed it to you earlier on. So I'm not going to go into great detail, but a lot of times people think we keep implementing it because it works. But I have a really terrible thing to tell you, and that is that the research says that just because an innovation, an intervention, an initiative works does not mean that it is more likely to sustain, which is certainly a scary thought. I guess I'm appealing to fear to keep you all awake at the end of a long couple of days. But here's some of the research that we've found over the last 10 years in the work that we've done about finding out what is it about this work for sustaining PBIS, but we think it actually applies broadly to MTSS for sure, to those who are thinking about integrating mental health like we saw in the ISF work, or those who are just thinking about broader team-based educational initiatives. So what I've got here is I've got some color-coded pictures of the most important predictors of whether systems would sustain over time. And you'll see the colors are related to the research studies showing this. And I've got these at the school level, the district level, and then also at the state level. So at the school level, where we know the most, effective and efficient teaming, teams that understand why they're there, the right people are there, meet regularly, have a common agenda, get work done is critical. Collecting and using data for decision-making. And then also, and this is something that gets lost out, the extent to which teams share data back with their whole staff is really, really important. And we think about if we're asking all of our staff, all of our teachers, educators, paraeducators, classified staff, certified, to collect all this information, whether it be office referrals or time out of class forms or fidelity of implementation forms, the fact that we can actually put it back to them and be able to say, this is what you told us, this is what our data show, and now we're going to explain to you how we're using it to make change. That's huge. And then another one, and this has been across multiple studies from different places, the more that teams implement PBIS in the classroom as opposed to non-classroom areas, the more likelihood of sustainability. Actually, the more likelihood of sustainability, the more likelihood of improved outcomes, and the more likelihood of racial equity in school discipline too. So really thinking about how are we seeing how well we're implementing those practices in the classroom is key. At the district level, having district training systems, district coaching systems, so we realize that professional learning does not end at the end of the professional development day, that there's ongoing support that happens, that we build communities of practice, so there's more peer-to-peer sharing in addition to the going and seeing the expert or going and getting the training. And then this one that I think is really key that we found is having those local implementation sites or model sites so that when other schools in the district or schools in a different district are thinking about implementing, they can see it and say, oh, that's what it's like. And it might address some of the misrules that people might have about that initiative and say, wow, this looks really, there's a lot of student voice in this. This looks much more student driven than compliance driven that I thought maybe it would have looked like. Now, we've got a little bit less research at the state, but there are still some, and one study taking a look at this. Effective state leadership teams if those teams or states have centralized training systems and a standardized training curriculum so that it's not up to every district to continue to build all of those things. I think that's important. And then this last part, states that were using the previous version of the SSFI, or State Systems Fidelity Inventory, those who are even, not necessarily their scores on it, but just the fact that they were using it increased the likelihood that their schools would sustain PBIS. So what I'm going to do with a few minutes here left after we've kind of seen this is I'm going to share with you a few common issues related to lack of sustainability or initiative abandonment, and then talk about some recommendations that we have. And of course, you've got these slides, so I'm not going to share with you all of the words on the page, but I'll kind of refer out. So one of the problems that we run into is when we've got one person running the show, meaning we've got one champion who was hired with school climate funds and is the visible one face who's making sure that we're pushing all of this together. So I'm going to show you a picture and I'm going to ask you to answer in chat, what is it a picture of? Okay, are you ready? We need a little bit of opportunities to respond out here. Okay, what is this a picture of? You are all wrong. This is Beyonce and two other people, okay? And what I mean by that is Destiny's Child was carried by Beyonce, and that's about it, right? When she was gone, it was gone, okay? So knowing that, thinking about if your initiative is just led by one Beyonce, it is not going to sustain, because that Beyonce is going to move on to different things, bigger and better, is going to move to a different district, is going to move to the state, is going to get promoted, right? So what we want to think about doing is think about teams and centering the work within existing teams that are already there, writing the work into job descriptions so that it's really clear, and then having a plan for recognizing if you've got that one champion, that you already have a plan in place for what's going to happen when that person moves on, right? Because turnover is inevitable. And so it's just how you handle that turnover that's the key part. All right. So one really key person, obviously, is a school administrator when you're thinking about that, but also district administrators. So there's an oldie but goodie article written by Kathleen Strickland Cohen and a couple other people, maybe me included, which talked about what are things that school teams can do to support when a new administrator comes into the building. And then what are the things that district teams can do when they have either school administrator turnover or actually district administrator turnover, support turnover. And some of that is continuing to build capacity, especially when new people come in, and thinking about what are the really efficient ways that we can do training. So if you have not been to PBIS Missouri in a little while, I would highly recommend that you go. There are a whole set of self-guided online learning modules about the elements and the basics of PBIS at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. So you can go and click on those and think about how can we bring new people up to speed without thinking that we're doing an intro to PBIS every single year for just a few people. All right. So number 2, when the initiative comes from one single source of funding. So I am sure that Beyonce and many other people have looked at the decrease in royalties coming in from music albums, right? So this is digital. This is buying CDs, which, you know, if you don't know what a CD is, ask your parents; they'll tell you. But you can see it's a huge drop over time. So be thinking about what are the other places that you can do. Can you get connected to streaming media, right? Can you start your own streaming media company? But what I really mean is, how do we instead start thinking about existing recurring funds that are there, but also show data that show how this initiative is meeting outcomes that people care about. So I'll give you one example. This is from our great colleagues in Wisconsin, looking at implementing, this is elementary schools implementing PBIS, implementing a school-wide early literacy model, and then also implementing cultural responsive pedagogy module in there. And what you can see here is this decrease in the risk of out-of-school suspensions over time. And you can see that red line here is this overall decrease, but you can also see a decrease, a real narrowing of the gap for Black or African-American students. And then you can also see a decrease for students with IEPs as well. So starting to think about that. And if you're looking for resources to do that, I know Brandy shared yesterday, the Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide was just re-revised last year. And if you haven't looked at it, the Guide for Discussing Race, Racism, and Important Current Events, is a really, really nice guide. We've gotten really good feedback on that. Last thing is, if the initiative is its own thing, and people say, this is school climate transformation grant, and here we go. And so think about, how are you going to connect with other people, with other initiatives, with other ones that have more consistent funding and availability, so that you can continue to build and broaden that empire. So connecting to longer standing initiatives as opposed to just that specific project. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to an exemplar presentation from Lincoln Public Schools, and they're going to be able to talk through their movement from what they did with their school climate data, and then what they're doing connecting moving forward with it in that time that that initial funding ended. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to, I believe I'm passing it over to Scott, but maybe I'm passing it over to Russ, or they're going to share and tag team.
Good. Okay, thank you, Ken. And I'll start us off here, and Scott and I will kind of trade off as the presentation goes along. So again, I'm Russ Uhing, I'm the Director of Student Services for Lincoln Public Schools. I'm joined by Scott Eckman, who is a longtime employee of LPS and really did a great job of leading our initiative of MTSS, and is now working for the Department of Education, for Nebraska Department of Education. So a little bit about Lincoln Public Schools. We're the second largest district in Nebraska. We have just under 42,000 students. Roughly 43% are free and reduced lunch. We've been a high-performing school district. We consistently score above state and national averages, and Lincoln continues to grow. We currently have 39 schools, but we'll have another elementary school opening this coming fall. We have 12 middle schools, and we currently have 6 high schools with 2 new ones opening in the next couple years. And again, that reflects the growth that's happening in Lincoln. So we started implementing PBIS. You'll hear Scott and I kind of alternately refer to as PBIS, but over the last 3 years, we refer to it as MTSS or MTSS-B. We started implementation 2012, 2013. Prior to that time, we put together a 5-year plan of implementation. And as we did that, we involved special education, student services, curriculum, staff development, as well as we worked on funding sources of how we would fund it as we went along. Fortunately, in the 3rd year of implementation, we received the School Climate Transformation Grant. And that really helped us to, I think about as a framework and prior to that. And the School Climate Transformation Grant really allowed us to provide more staff development. It allowed us to increase the social emotional learning curriculum and training for our staff. We were able to do a lot more as far as training more groups of people and also expand and make our process much stronger. We have used, even in our planning stage, Lucille, I see, is on this call and was a great benefit to us in our initial planning, but also as we kind of continued to go through and received our grant, utilizing the Midwest PBIS Center was of great benefit to us along the way, especially in areas of Tier 2. We are able to also get training not only around Tier 2 practices, but also roles of clinicians, referring to social workers, school counselors, and school psychs. And part of that is identifying and more clearly clarifying roles between them. During that same time, we were also able to greatly increase the number of staffing in those mental health supports too, which was matching the growing need of increased behavior and social, emotional, mental health needs with our students. We implemented Second Step during this time, and that included not only buying the curriculum and the materials, as we did for pre-K through 7th grade, but is also training teachers, training clinicians, et cetera, to help us implement it. We partnered with the University of Nebraska Center for Children, Families, and the Law to provide trauma training for all of our schools, all of our administrators and clinicians, and it really changed our language within our district around trauma and the impact of trauma on learning and behavior with students. Part of that, part of our tiered intervention was CBITS, which was a Tier 2 trauma support for students that we've been able to implement. That is something the groups are facilitated by the social workers in our buildings. So part of what we wanted to make sure that we did is, as we were looking at using the School Climate Transformation Grant, we wanted to use it, and Ken had mentioned this earlier, and we wanted it to continue long after the grant was over. And so what we tried to do is we tried to build up capacity and knowledge and really culture in the way that we did business within our district. And so really the only funding towards staff that we used was around the grant coordinator. Everything else was related to those areas that I had kind of shared. So the other piece that we wanted it to be is something that again was just a part of LPS and a long-standing part of LPS. And one of the ways that we were able to do that is add that as a policy for us. So this is the LPS policy 5400 around behavior. And you can see it certainly lines with PBIS or MTSS-B. And in addition, it is part of appraisal for us. So this is a section of our principal appraisal. And this is the proficient, you know, if a principal is proficient in this area, this is kind of what that rubric looks like. The other thing that we did is we utilized the Danielson model for appraisal with our teachers. And what we did is we aligned and showed how with different areas of the appraisal manual for teachers, we looked at how effective classroom practices aligned with what was in the Danielson model. So I mentioned before about social emotional learning. We've used primarily Second Step. We also have used skill streaming in our high schools and middle schools as a resource, along with Boys Town lessons. This is kind of the implementation that we did for Second Step. We started again in 2015-16, taking a look at kindergarten and first grade. And then we've kind of proceeded where we have pre-K through 7th now. And we continue to look at ways that we're able to expand the use of second step. And that's been especially important these last couple of years. You know, as we know, COVID has caused increase in mental health issues, anxiety, depression, behavioral issues, et cetera. So we've continued to look at ways that we can utilize that. So again, when we talk about sustainability and how we do business, these are all different areas that kind of came about through the School Climate Transformation Grant. When you talk about, if you say tier 1, tier 2 planning days in LPS, now everyone knows it's a summer activity, and it's around planning that we do for each team. So every building has a tier 1 team, tier 2 team, and part of what we utilize is time within the summer for them to be able to plan for the next school year. So that once once all staff start coming back, they're able to share what their plan is and how they maybe changed it from the previous year. A big part of that is using their TFI and SAS outcome data for the previous years to see the areas that they have to address. We've also looked at new teachers. So we have a week of new teacher orientation, and part of that has been around an overview of MTSS-B, and also has been the effective classroom practices. And it's not only sharing the information, but it's specifically designed for some things for them to start thinking about as they begin teaching. Teachers for tenure in their first 3 years have to take 3 different courses. And part of that now is around MTSS-B. Again, it's a broad overview of it along with the effective classroom practices. And again, that's a way that we can capture every new teacher, whether it's a first-year teacher or a veteran teacher coming to us from another district. We're also able to use our School Climate Transformation Grant for the PBIS conference in Chicago each year. And so that has been a great benefit for us. Of course, these last couple of years, it has been virtually, but we still have every year, we've got a large contingent of our staff that attend that conference. So data, again, when we started, one of the challenges that we had is, one, we didn't have much discipline data. Most of it revolved around only suspensions and expulsions. The other thing is, it was not very accessible by our schools. So when we talked about reviewing, tier 1, tier 2 data with schools, it was difficult for them to access it. And so that made planning around it very difficult. So what we did is I'm going to skip a slide here, but we worked with our computing services department, and we created a vision, I guess, for them to work with us on developing. So I think we've got a very robust data system that's easily accessible and just a part of how our teams now do business. We have an early warning system as part of that looks at grades, attendance, and discipline so that they can look at things in more totality, not just discipline, but other areas of a student's life as well. We've got the Big 5 data. That's very easily, again, that we're able to look at as part of their planning and what they would do maybe as far as lessons and so on. And then we have custom reports. So in your upper right-hand corner, you can see a triangle that we use, and this would be an example from a school. In this one, it's about, I believe it's minor behaviors that this one is, but we also have around suspensions or expulsions, and schools can kind of see and tell that, if their tier 1 is 50-60% or elsewhere, that it's a strong message to them that they've got to do some pretty strong tier 1 planning. It also allows us to do tier 2 data collection through a check-in, check-out procedure, data collection procedure as well. So that has been a big part of it. And that was really a difference maker too, as we went through planning. It would have been nice when we started our endeavor to have that all in place, but it was something that fortunately, because we have worked strongly with other departments, we've been able to develop that. So Scott is now going to talk a little bit about some shared leadership.
Yeah, so thank you again. So we'll talk about a couple of other things that we really tried to be explicit about in terms of thinking about sustainability. So Dr. McIntosh talked about, trying to avoid maybe say the champion, whether it be at the building or the district level. So really what we did was we tried to look at ways that we could spread that leadership around to different groups. When we first started, I remember we kind of assigned PBIS to say an administrator at the building. It was usually an AP. And, a lot of that went well, but then we kind of realized, kind of like the article that Kent had shared, is that we had a lot of staff turnover. We had, say, assistant principals moving up to principals, et cetera. How do we share that leadership a little bit more? So we did that in a few different ways. I can't reference district coaching. So we have had district MTSS-B coaches in kind of a different capacity across the years. The numbers went down and then have gone up and went down a little bit and so forth, just depending on different things. This was a repurposing of special education and student services funding and FTE, but they've played an integral, in a super important role in our success of implementation. So having coaches be able to support schools with implementation and provide system checks and supports. And then Russ had mentioned that action planning, being able to support schools in their action plannings and work with administrators and other teachers, as well as supporting classroom teachers more on an individual level. So our coaches have been really important for us in that. Another important thing that we did was, So through the School Climate Transformation Grant, we were able to actually take a visit to Illinois and visited a few different high schools in Illinois. And they had kind of a different role in terms of like how classroom teachers were able to provide some, say, more leadership role in PBIS. And from those visits, we brought about what we called MTSS-B liaisons. So in Lincoln Public Schools, we actually have what are called liaisons for a lot of different areas, reading, math, air quality, there's a lot of different things. And a lot of times it comes like with a very minimal stipend. So we were able to use funding to establish MTSS-B liaisons. I'd say the vast majority of them are classroom teachers, some school psychs, counselors, et cetera, but really kind of building that teacher leadership within buildings. So they met quarterly with our external coaches and our district staff, split in between elementary and middle. And a lot of the things that we are doing with liaisons, and I should say we still have liaisons and they still continue to provide leadership in buildings. But we do things like talking about conducting TFI walkthroughs, really spent a lot of time focused around fidelity and action planning. We practiced developing precise problem statements so that they could support their teams. And then we eventually got to a point where we were creating quarterly themes and providing challenges to liaisons who then could bring that back to the team. And then it was just a really good resource for them to idea share and collaborate as well. So kind of transferring again, like I said, the leadership to more teachers was a really good move for us. Russ mentioned the work with trauma. I won't go into a huge amount of detail with it, but basically we were able to really go through working with a partner from the University of Nebraska, professional development around trauma-informed care and so forth. But one of the key pieces that we did was we really looked at our social workers to be trained to provide those trauma walkthroughs using a checklist. So that again, we're not reliant, say, on an outside provider. We are also looking at ways that we can provide more professional learning on trauma, whether it's in person or virtually. And then kind of like what Kent mentioned, here was a huge initiative talking about trauma-informed care and trauma-informed schools. How do we connect that with the work that we're doing through PBIS? So we did a lot of adapting from the amazing stuff that Midwest PBIS Center has already put out in terms of that topic, and really made sure that we were aligning it. The other two pieces in terms of that shared leadership was administrators and clinicians. So first with administrators, administrators have monthly meetings. So principals have a meeting altogether, APs have a meeting altogether, and then we also have coordinators who meet as well. Again, kind of going back to what Russ was saying about priority is we're able to have MTSS-B on the agenda every month so that we can have direct contact with administrators on a regular basis, and really, again, helping them build their capacity to support the work in their buildings. So again, talking about things like fidelity, we spent a large amount of time over the past 3 years talking about alternatives to suspension and disproportionality in discipline data. Russ mentioned the different data sources that we now are available. We used Dr. McIntosh's and colleagues' 5-point intervention article, the culturally responsive field guide, and really just had more kind of almost like a book study, if you will, with administrators around those, and allowed them to practice accessing that data and again, providing precise problem statements for action planning. And then clinicians, and I know that the people before us had talked about this as well. We've done a lot of work on the role of clinicians, so school psychologists, social workers, and counselors within MTSS-B, and really have tried to work to define that, along with ensuring all three of those groups were proficient to support in their buildings around the functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention plan process. So really trying to build clinician capacity and leadership to spread that leadership that we mentioned before. And then kind of the last area that we, and Russ had mentioned this before, but I think it is important to remind us is whenever possible, we really try to utilize train the trainer model to really increase the opportunity for internal trainings and not necessarily reliant on, say, an outside provider. So a few examples of that were wraparound. We have some internal trainers of wraparound. We did, Russ mentioned CBITS. We had some people trained in Boys Town specialized classroom management as well, again, so that they could provide PD support for buildings when they were in need, which has been really helpful to kind of sustain that process over time. All right, and then like I mentioned, the last kind of big idea action step, if you will, in terms of sustainability was just like with leadership. We also kind of realized pretty quickly that in terms of our professional learning, a lot of it was guided specifically towards just building wide teams, or building tier 1 teams or tier 2 teams. And really, we didn't have access to a lot of educators across buildings. So we really tried to focus on how could we provide those opportunities for all staff to continue to build just this general capacity and understanding of what we mean and what we talk about with MTSS and so forth across all 3 tiers. So Russ had mentioned a couple of them, but I want to just quickly talk a little bit about them again. The first one, yikes. All right, the first one, is we mentioned new teachers. So again, this is kind of, I remember Kent talking at a national forum one day about, one year about attaching kind of PBIS to naturally recurring events. And this was one of the first things that we did, was that in LPS, we had a new teacher breakfast that happens every year. So we were able to attach kind of thinking about PBIS and talking about PBIS to that breakfast. That has now evolved a little bit, and Russ mentioned to now where we have these topics within tenure, meaning we have access to all certified staff within their first 3 years. So that was one thing where we really we started it with this idea of recurring events, but now have established this process where we can train all new staff in these areas every year. So that's been very exciting for us. We also talk about a lot of times, again, just trying to spread our reach. So not the greatest form of professional development we know, but we spent a lot of time building our website so that we could provide that as a resource for staff. So thinking about things like effective classroom practices, going through function-based thinking, recording webinars, et cetera. And then even had the opportunity that they could ask a coach if they were struggling with a particular concept or behavior. So this has, again, been kind of a long-standing resource now for teachers. And Russ had mentioned connecting it to appraisals and so forth. So that's been a really good benefit for us. And then the last one is kind of a unique situation, but it was born from the School Climate Transformation Grant. So I feel like it was worth mentioning, is we did use some of the funding for School Climate Transformation Grant to start what we refer to as the Supporting Positive Behavior Conference, which basically, again, our goal with this was to bring teachers who might not go to PBIS or trainings to the table so that they could learn from national experts and also local practitioners. It continues to grow, and now it's self-sustaining, where we just roll it over every year and have built our wider and wider net in terms of participants from over 40 districts in Nebraska and beyond. So that's been really exciting for us. And again, it has become just a naturally occurring event that everyone is expecting, both in Lincoln and across Nebraska. So Russ is just going to talk quickly about our next steps, and then we'll finish in the next 2 minutes.
Okay, so hopefully you've had an opportunity to see how we were able to utilize the School Climate Transformation Grant. You know, it's a priority for us because it's part of our policy, it's part of our appraisals. It's really the language we speak in LPS now. We've got a very robust data system that teams have very easy access to. We've spread out leadership, not only among administrators, but also amongst our clinicians and different liaisons, which are generally teachers in buildings. We have annual planning times and professional development. So those are all parts that are annual things that we do and embedded within our practices. So what are our next steps? Well, one, we've got 4 different Board of Education goals, and one of them is related to behavior and specifically not only reducing overall suspensions, but reducing our disproportionality of our discipline data. So we were also fortunate enough to receive the Project Prevent grant. Part of that is we've been able to partner with Dr. McIntosh and Ruthie Penal-Simmons to help provide not only resources, but also staff development for our schools. We will have our elementary schools that part of their planning will be a couple days with Ruthie and Kent. We are refocusing on Tier 1 fidelity. I think COVID caused some kind of scaling back a little bit, just because we had a lot of kids being remote. We had a hybrid learning model going on, and so it wasn't maybe the priority or the planning that we had. And then we're trying to align our equity work, our academic work, and our behavioral supports to make it coherent and for staff to be able to see the intersection between all of those so that they're not looked at as separate things. So we appreciate the time that you have given us, and we've got our contact information there. You saw we have a behavior conference, so let us know if you're interested in attending that. It'll be virtual again this year. We also have various resources on our website as well. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Russ and Scott. That was really wonderful. To make sure that we get out on time, you can see that we've got a little prompt here if you want to think about what next step you're going to take. There's also a question that Ellen asked too about what beyond COVID do you see as threats to ongoing implementation, and what are your fidelity data showing? And what I would encourage you to do is, maybe if it's all right, answer in chat, just so that we can make sure to give Carlette and Nicole the time that they need to get us out on time. So please join me in thanking Russ and Scott for this session.